Aloha, I'm Terry Lilley, a marine biologist here in the Hawaiian Islands. I hope you enjoy my film. Our scuba diving adventure to the beautiful Galapagos Islands began way up in the Andes Mountains in the city of Quito. We then flew down to the coastal town of Guayaquil and then 600 miles out into the open ocean to the Galapagos Islands. When you first see these beautiful islands from the air, it is truly amazing. They're all volcanic, they're over 1 million years old, and they're just dotted along in the beautiful deep blue sea. We're really excited about flying over and getting our first look at the Galapagos because we know we're going to be scuba diving there soon. When you get off of the airplane, you're met with a heat wave. The Galapagos Islands are a very hot desert island. The Galapagos Volcanic Islands are much the way that they were way back in 1835 when they were visited by Charles Darwin. Some of the volcanoes there are still erupting, and you can see lots of twisted lava out on the open and cinder cones almost every time you take a boat ride. There's deserted beaches that you go by. You're not allowed to land on those beaches, but there are some of the islands, like this Cactus Island, that you're allowed to go on to go hiking. The views are just stunning from all over the Galapagos Islands, especially when you can hike up on top of some of the cinder cones and look down. Volcanic pinnacles, volcanic arches dot the entire island chain. Almost everywhere you look, it's incredibly beautiful and very remote. The only way you can get to most of the Galapagos Islands is by boat. The very northernmost islands, Wolf Island, Darwin, Genovese, take up to 14 hours by boat ride to just get there. Everybody on the Galapagos goes from island to island or boat to boat in these little Zodiac boats. So that's kind of the main transport and the main way you get around. These islands are fully protected and you're not allowed to go on shore unless you go with a naturalist licensed guide, whether you're doing a hiking tour or a dive charter. This keeps the islands incredibly pristine and the wildlife there protected and incredibly friendly towards human beings. With the naturalist guides, you'll get to get out and visit some of the most stunning wildlife on Earth. These islands are the most isolated ecosystem, and the animals there are completely unafraid of people. You can be walking by and having these Nazca Boobies or the blue-footed boobies just sit there within a foot or two away looking at you or even chattering at you as you walk by. It is one of the rare places on Earth where you can get this close to the wildlife, not harm it whatsoever, and the animals are incredibly curious about the presence of humans there. Sea lions lay around on the beaches all over the islands, have their cute little babies on the beach, and basically they just ignore humans that are walking around taking a look or taking their pictures. And once again, there's only a very few places in all of the Galapagos that you can actually go on land, and they're designated trails, and you have to have a naturalist tour guide. You can see here the sea lions will actually come right up and live in town with all the people. They're on all the remote islands, but they're also on islands like Santa Cruz, and they climb right up into the fish marketplace and beg for food. It's really an amazing sight to see. The people here just live with wildlife day by day because it's all protected. You can see the sea lions laying around on the side of the sidewalk or on the chairs at the hotel. And they're also sitting there with a whole host of different birds, the pelicans, herons. This sea lion here is really cute. Comes up every morning to the fish market and begs for little scraps of fish. And then the fishermen feed the pelicans. And at the same time, you have marine iguanas walking around. So the Galapagos is really a pristine, wonderful place if you're a nature lover, because people there have had to learn with nature, and they do so in a very sustainable way. The islands are completely protected, and so is the wildlife. This is a really cool marine iguana. It's the only place in the world where these lizards, reptiles, live on land and also go out and feed underneath the water on seaweed. They're a one-of-a-kind species. On some of the islands are these big, gigantic, dinosaur-looking land iguanas. They live in the hot area and eat cactus. The marine iguanas basically live on the beach, and here one is eating the salt grass, and they have to stay warm in the sun because they're cold-blooded. So every single day you'll see them lounging around at the beach. They are the true and real Godzilla. Here, a whole family of marine iguanas, after being out in the ocean that's cold and eating the seaweed, come up and lay up on the beach to get warm. It's really truly amazing just to be walking downtown and seeing these marine iguanas hanging out on the seawalls and sidewalks and patio tables. Quite a unique place. Out on Genovese Island, you can take a hike through the bird rookeries. These are all the frigate birds. And once again, they have zero fear of people, so you can approach pretty close. These are called red Sally Lightfoot crabs, and they crawl around on the sidewalks and the rocks at almost every beach. And then you'll come around the corner and there'll be a big great blue heron just sitting there on the sand. Most of the scuba diving in the Galapagos Islands is done off these liveaboard boats. These islands are incredibly remote, and most of them you're not allowed to go on by foot. So you have to take off on these long cruises to get out to the islands, like Wolf Island, Darwin Island up in the north. And then you take these very small, high-speed Zodiac boats out to the dive site. This is really great because only a few people every single week are allowed to go visit each one of these dive sites, which keeps the animals incredibly tame and very pristine environment, just the way it's been for thousands of years. Diving is not easy out in the Galapagos Islands like many other dive sites across the world. The seas here are quite rough. There's lots of bounce, lots of waves, lots of upwelling from deep down in the ocean, and that brings up a lot of nutrients. Like out at Wolf Island and Darwin Island, way up on the north, the currents just rip through the islands. This brings in massive amounts of fish, and that's one of the main reasons that you go to this area, is to see the big schools of fish that you just don't see in many other places in the world. Once you leave the little boat and take your dive, you need to get down to the bottom very quickly because of the currents. The first thing you notice is the massive amount of fish. The big schools of Creole fish and Salima, Parrot Fish and Angelfish are all swimming into the currents, and often you don't even have to kick at all. The currents will just take you zooming right on by all of the fish. It's really one of the most magical dive sites I've ever been to. And again, the marine life there is much the way it's been for eons of time before humans even showed up. Big schools of jacks cruise by, all kinds of big fish, right on down to the small bait fish. It's really interesting diving this way, because you really don't have to kick during the dive much. Most of the dives are drift dives, and often you're going so fast that you simply have to hold on to the bare reef to keep from going right on by some of the schools of fish. There's lots of these Mexican hogfish that are there. These are females. The males are big. They have the red colors with the big band and the big hump on their head. These fish are hilarious. They actually follow all of the divers as you go by, along with the angelfish that'll cruise in the cracks and out on the open right with the divers. Sometimes, like I said again, you are going so fast in the current you have to hold on to the rocks to keep from being washed by all of the cool fish. Little fish hang out in the caves, big fish are cruising right on by, and it is really an amazing adventure in relatively cold water. The dives may last for 45 minutes to an hour, and then you're basically frozen. Here it's really fun because Pamela's feeding one of the Mexican hogfish. All you have to do is pick up a piece of barnacle and knock it onto the rock, and these big old hogfish come by to investigate to see if there's something good to eat. The rocks out here are covered with barnacles. There's not very much coral, so it's okay to hold on to the rocks because you're not hurting any of the marine life. And then the hogfish follow you along because when you hold on to the rocks, you dislodge some of the invertebrates that live within the barnacles. So the hogfish are right there to grab up all the food. So they're kind of like little puppy dogs following you. Often you look up in the currents and see big hammerhead sharks cruising by and all kinds of other incredibly cool marine life. Once you've been down for about an hour, you're basically frozen. So you come back up to the surface, and it's a drift dive. So you come back up to the surface, completely different spot on the island where you went down. The high-speed boats come and pick you up right away and get you back on the boat. Take you back to the liveaboard where you hydrate, try to get warm, and get ready for your next diving adventure. A lot of the fish that live in the Galapagos Islands also live in northern Peru all the way up to southern Mexico. And that's because of the 6 or 7 currents that converge and actually meet in the Galapagos Islands. This is a beautiful king angelfish that are very common here in the Galapagos. Sometimes you'll see them in large schools, or about a foot long. Other times you'll just see them hanging out by themselves eating sponges in the caves. They also eat small invertebrates, and I even observed some of them eating bird poop that was coming down from above from the booby birds. When they're young, they're more brightly banded colors, blue and gold. And as they get older, they just get these stunning yellow and blue colors. Here's one in a crack with one of the Bellinis. They always seem like they're feeding. Once again, sponges are about their favorite food, so their food items are actually really small, so it's hard to kind of see what they're eating. This one was cruising in a cave with one of the fine spot Moray Eels. They're really, really, really gorgeous fish when you see them intermixed in big schools with the other fish like the surgeonfish and Salima and Parrotfish. They're always active, poking around in the rocks looking for something to eat. This one here you can see is kind of hiding out in one of the cracks in the caves with one of the sea cucumbers and a pencil urchin. One of my favorite fish in the Galapagos are these big Mexican hogfish. They are just magical to watch. They're very friendly. Now these hogfish are a type of wrasse, and the wrasse are normally all hatched out as female. You'll see on these hogfish, the females are really beautiful. They're small and they're yellow and orange color. And as they get older, some convert into these big males. They call them super males. As they get older and older and older, they develop more of a hump on top of their head. So these big 2-footers have a very, very large hump, which also tells you they're one of the older fish that are out there. They eat invertebrates, they have very strong jaws. They eat invertebrates, and they like to eat and crush the barnacles. You can see this one is actually crushing one of the hard barnacles and eating the soft animal inside. Here's one of the females. They're incredibly colorful. They follow the scuba divers around because when you dive in the Galapagos, there's a lot of currents, so the divers often have to hold on to the rocks. And when they hold on to the rocks, they dislodge some of the barnacles. These are the surgeonfish, and they're called surgeonfish because of the razor-sharp spine at the base of their tail. These ones locally are known as a razor surgeonfish. If you try to grab one, or you're fishing and you catch one, these can severely cut your hand. They feed on the algae on the reefs, and you see them in big schools along with these Selima. The Selima are a small type of bait fish, and there are literally millions of them in some of these schools. They're attracted to the area because of the upwelling of the nutrients, and you often see them in areas where the cold water from the southern or northern currents comes down and intermixes with the warmer water from the southern currents. These Selima are food to booby birds and lots of the other fish that live in the area. The Creole fish here is one of the most common fish in all of the Galapagos. You'll see big schools of them, and they feed primarily on floating algae. And the algae kind of comes up from the deep water upwelling, but sometimes you'll see them just hanging out on the cliffs with the black coral here, and kind of just resting on the side of the ledges. Sometimes there'll literally be 500 to 1,000 of these Creole fish in one gigantic school. In the northern part of the Galapagos, where the water is a little colder, you often see scallop hammerhead sharks. It's one of the things that divers from all around the world come to visit, are these incredible sharks. They mostly feed on rays and other sharks and different types of fish. These scallop hammerheads can get about 10 feet long, and their eyes are mounted way on each side of their head. One of the reasons they have a big flat head like that is there's electromagnetic receptors that are underneath the snout that they can sense their food with. The silky sharks here, they get about 8 to 10 feet long. They're mid-ocean sharks, so more often you see those following the dive boat. Here there was about a dozen of them following the dive boat that we saw in between our scuba dives. The whitetip reef sharks, they get about 7 feet long. They're very common in the Galapagos. They're one of the only sharks that actually can sleep on the seafloor without moving. Here they're riding the currents that are almost running full-time in the northern Galapagos. These sharks, they really specialize eating crustaceans and octopus, and they're often seen with their head back in a crack pulling out a crab. The Galapagos shark is very common. These get to be about 8 to 10 feet long and 300 pounds. They're also quite aggressive if there's blood in the water. Spear fishermen have to be quite careful when they're around them. One of the most magical creatures in the Galapagos are the big whale sharks. Normally they only come through, they migrate, they only come through late in the year, October and November. This is one of the biggest fish in the world. They're called gentle giants. These 45 to 50 foot long fish don't even have teeth. They have what's called gill rakers. They cruise through the open ocean. They open their mouth and they filter out krill and small fish for their food. Even though they're really tame, they're an incredible animal to dive with. They have no fear of people, but they have a 3,000-pound tail. So one has to be very careful when you're scuba diving close to one of these big whale sharks. They're really a very magical treat to see in the Galapagos, and you only see them a certain time of the year. Some of these sharks will migrate up to 5,000 to 8,000 miles in their lifetime, feeding on krill across the open ocean with their mouth wide open. One of the more special animals that you get to see. The eagle rays here, they get to about a 6-foot wingspan. They have a big flat nose because they have electromagnetic receptors under their snout. Same with these big gigantic stingrays. They get about 6-7 feet long, and they can sense, basically feel with their electromagnetic receptors, crabs and clams that live under the sand. So these big stingrays will cruise along the bottom and look for crabs and clams, dig them up to eat them. These cow-nose rays, sometimes you see them in schools of up to 50 and 100, often near creek mouths and lagoons. The smaller long-tailed stingrays here are very common in the Galapagos. And you can see this one here is actually digging in the sand, looking for the crabs and looking for shrimp and crabs and clams that live below the sand. Once again, they can perceive these animals. They know that they're there because they're using their electromagnetic sensors. There's lots of types of jacks that live in the Galapagos Islands, and these are the big bluefin trevally. Often you'll see these 3-foot-long fish flowing in the currents when the tide changes. Sometimes there's big schools like this one have 10 or 12. Other times they'll just be all by themselves. These fish eat smaller fish, same with this big Amico jack. And then you'll see really huge schools of these big-eye jacks. Sometimes these fish, they will be up to 50 to 150 in one school. These large fish, when they're breeding, they go off kind of in pairs. The males are dark, the females are light. You'll see these black jacks go by, and then at the same time, enormous schools of these jacks. And again, they're feeding primarily on the upwelling that brings up nutrients in a lot of small fish. These are the big brown sea bass called bacalhau, and you normally see this big fish kind of hanging out in the caves with the black corals. And then these really neat flag cabria are pretty much all over the reef. They kind of hang out on the ledges, very motionless. They're so tame you can go right up and look into their face. And they hang around eating the smaller fish. This is a rough triggerfish, about 14 inches long. And they're called triggerfish because they have a dorsal spine on top of their back. This one's a red-tailed triggerfish. They can actually go into a cave or a crack and put up the dorsal spine that locks themselves into the cave so predators can't get to them. This one's a fine-scaled triggerfish that's 2.5 feet long. These triggerfish have fused teeth, and they eat mollusks and barnacles and crabs and really hard creatures on the reef. There's 2 types of stickfish here, the cornet fish and the trumpet fish. They get about 3 feet long. This one here is the leather bass with the beautiful yellow stripe on the tail. These big fish will cruise right through the middle of the divers looking for food. This is a school of gray chubs. They eat floating algae that's brought up on the upwelling currents. There's several types of parrotfish here in the Galapagos. This is the biggest one. That's a humphead parrotfish. This one's a blue chin. These parrotfish are wrasses, and they're all hatched out as female. Some of the females, when they get older, convert into males and turn into these bright colors. The females are much more drab in color, like this female blue-chin parrotfish. These fish are incredibly important because they actually make the sand that's on the beaches here in the Galapagos Islands. These fish bite at the reef constantly, and they eat little bits of coral and also algae off of the rocks. So they're taking in a bunch of coral and rocks in their diet, and they poop that out, and that's what goes up onto the beach and makes the sand. This one here is living in the seaweed. There's lots of eels that live in the Galapagos Islands, and the most common is this garden eel that sticks its body in the sand with its head up, filtering out pieces of plankton. Then crawling across the rubble in the sand are these really beautiful tiger snake eels. A lot of times people mistake the snake eel for a sea snake. But if you see, these eels have a fin going all the way down their back. Sea snakes do not have any fins whatsoever. This eel cruises along the sand looking for invertebrates to eat, but it spends most of its time underneath the sand, so you don't actually see them that often. These are the really beautiful fine spot moray eels. Now this moray eel gets like 6 feet long. They look like they're trying to bite you, but actually they're not. They breathe through their mouth, and so when you get close to them, they get nervous, and they open their mouth to breathe more. Here's a couple of them in one hole. It's a little jeweled moray eel. These morays have big teeth because they eat fish, and they grab the fish and eat it whole like a snake would do on land. This is a glass-eyed fish. Swimming out in front of its cave are these Mexican goatfish. Then you have big schools of these burrito grunts. They actually underwater make kind of a grunting noise when they feed, and that's how they get their name. They usually cruise around in the currents. One of my favorite fish here in the Galapagos is this Harlequin Wrasse. This 18-inch long fish is a different color for every single fish. Some are yellow, some are white, some are black, some have a mixture of colors. The older ones develop this hump on their head. They're incredibly beautiful and very unique. I mean, very few places in the world is every fish in a species a different color. What they do is they tear off the algae off of the rocks, because underneath that algae are invertebrates, small crustaceans, crabs, shrimp. So in order to get to them, they tear off the algae, and then they eat all the little critters that are hiding in the base of the algae. Really neat fish. They tend to like the colder waters up in the northern part of the Galapagos Islands. These big spot-fin burrfish, up to 20 inches long. Now these are the fish. They're a type of porcupine fish, which is a type of pufferfish. They're the ones that can fill up with water and look like a big balloon with spikes on it. You have the Bullseye pufferfish, the Galapagos pufferfish. Now all of these pufferfish have a chemical called a tetrodotoxin in their skin, which is highly poisonous, so not much will eat them. These guinea fowl pufferfish are really amazing here in the Galapagos because almost every one of them is a different color. Some of them are black with white spots, some of them are completely yellow, some of them are half and half, some of them are even white. This is why Charles Darwin so much loved the Galapagos Islands, because the diversity and natural selection throughout the islands will make one fish one color on one island, and on a different island it could be a completely different color. The guinea fowl pufferfish are named that way because they're the same color as the guinea fowl, black with white spots on it. This is a gold-rimmed surgeonfish, brown surgeonfish. Once again, all the surgeonfish have that spine down by their tail that's incredibly sharp that you need to stay away from, especially if you're going to spearfish or try to catch one. These are the blue-striped snappers. Here they're hanging out in a cave with some beautiful black corals. There's several types of butterfly fish that live in the Galapagos Islands, like this deep-water scathed butterfly fish that usually hangs out by itself, or this three-banded butterfly fish you'll see in pairs, and then the barber fish you often see in these huge schools. Now most of these butterfly fish, they eat coral polyps. You have these gorgeous Moorish idols that you see in pairs, and then the scorpion fish that looks just like a stone with the poisonous spine on its dorsal fin, so you need to stay away from these fish. And then you'll often see flounders going by. These flatfish get about 20 inches long, and both their eyes are on the same side of their body. These barred sirena sit up on the cliffs, and very common in the Galapagos are the hawkfish. This long-nosed hawkfish only lives in the branches of black coral. This is the giant hawkfish that's rarely seen anywhere else in the world. And then you have these coral hawkfish that use their front pectoral fins as little hands or little arms. They sit up on top of the coral, and then when you get close to them, they dart into the coral for protection. One of the strangest fish in the Galapagos Islands is this little dinky 5-inch long red-lipped batfish. This fish has kind of a unicorn type horn on the top of its head, and then it walks along the bottom using its fins as legs. It really doesn't like to swim. It'd much rather walk around. This is a really beautiful Bravo clinid, which is only about 10 inches long. The males, when they're breeding, are this really pretty white, black, and yellow color. Most of the time they're dark brown or reddish color like this female. This is the gigantic Panamic Bellini. Most Bellinis are really small, but this one grows to be about 10 inches long and lives in the surf zone. There's lots of different little damsel fish in the Galapagos. These little 3-inch long fish actually have algae farms and protect them from other fish. Following the big Mexican hogfish in the divers, you often see these really beautiful sunset wrasse. They follow along and eat up the little invertebrates that everyone scares off the reef. There are many beautiful and unique reef creatures in the Galapagos Islands, but none as obvious as these Sally Lightfoot crabs. They virtually on every single part of the coastline, whether it's remote or right in a downtown area. They crawl around on the rocks eating algae. Highly colorful, the young ones are spotted. There's many different kinds of starfish in the Galapagos, from these horned starfish to orange starfish, all kinds of them out on the sand and all the way up on the reef and the rocks, like these velvet starfish that can lose their legs and grow them back. The beautiful blue starfish, tan starfish, yellow spotted starfish. The starfish are really all over the place in the Galapagos. It's one of the neat things you see on most of the scuba dives. These are the red cushioned starfish. They're about a foot across. Sometimes you'll see 10 or 20 on one dive, out on the sand and also up on the rocks. And they're very ubiquitous. This is the chocolate chip starfish. There's several different types of lobsters out on the reef in the Galapagos Islands, a red lobster. These lobsters get pretty big, but they're usually hiding way back in the cracks, so it's kind of cool to be able to see them. There's octopus in the Galapagos, although they're not really very common. A lot of the big fish will eat them, but if you look close, you can usually find one maybe once every 10 or 12 dives. Sea cucumbers, they're back in almost all of the cracks. There's several different types of sea urchins. One of them, these collector urchins, they roll around on the bottom and they have little tube feet on the top of their backs, and they actually hold on to rocks and pebbles. This is the giant spine sea urchin that you don't want to touch, poisonous spines. These sea urchins are the pencil sea urchin, which is very common, and they actually break apart and make a lot of the beaches in the Galapagos. Beautiful shells like this horse conch shell. These are sponges that are growing on top of razor clams. It's really pretty cool. All the beautiful colors are actually sponges, and they're growing back in the caves on these clams. Scallops are out on the reef. They have really beautiful lips when they're open. When they're closed, they look just like a rock, so you can't see them very well. There's a number of different types of sponges, and they almost all grow back in the caves where it's dark. These sponges filter out the seawater and help clean the seawater. This one here looks like a plant growing back in the cave, but it's actually a type of sponge. This is a tunicate that sucks in water and filters the seawater. In some of the caves, they're just coated with these colonial sea anemones. Being in the Galapagos Islands as a marine biologist and an avid reptile lover is truly magical. There is nowhere else in the world that you can walk down a deserted beach and see these gigantic 3-foot-plus marine iguanas strolling on the sand. These big lizards are cold-blooded, so that means that their body temperature is pretty much whatever it is out in the ambient temperature out on the beach. They have to lay on the sand to get their stomach warm enough to digest the seaweed that they're going to eat out on the reef under the water. Being cold-blooded, once again, they have to stay really, really, really warm so their body functions correctly. If they don't, they'll freeze up and they wouldn't be able to move and feed. So for hours, every single morning, these marine iguanas lay on the hot lava rocks out in the sunshine till they get extremely warm. Their heartbeat increases dramatically. Sometimes you'll see 200 to 300 of these marine iguanas in one colony hanging out on the lava rocks. The babies here and the young ones hang out with the adults, but it's only the adult males that actually go out into the water, underwater diving to feed on the seaweed. During the morning and afternoon, they're laying up on the rocks just trying to get warm. That's a primary part of their life. They pile on top of each other because that reserves and holds in their body heat. These big lizards lay their eggs up on the sandy beach. They dig a hole 1 foot to 2 feet deep. They lay 2 to 6 eggs. When the babies hatch, sometimes they're eaten by predators like this great blue heron. The lizards have to lay their eggs a certain depth in the sand because the eggs have to be a certain temperature for about 2 to 3 months to stay warm to hatch. The young marine iguanas don't feed out underwater. They feed in the tide pools. You'll see them actually crawling around on the cliffs. During low tide, the big male marine iguanas will venture out once they get warm enough and dive underwater and eat the seaweed out on the reef. These lizards are incredibly tough. They swim right through the big waves, and this is really cold water, so they can only stay out for about a half an hour to an hour, and then they get too cold to be able to move. The big males are excellent swimmers. They can dive down to 20, 30, 40 feet deep, and they can stay underwater for all the way up to about a half an hour. It is really, truly amazing out scuba diving and watching these big lizards zooming all over the place. They have very, very strong jaws, a very short snout, and very strong legs, and that way they can hold on to the rocks underwater while they're feeding on the seaweed. It's truly an amazing sight to see. Now, it's only the big males that go out underwater and eat the algae off the reef. You can tell a male from a female because the males, first of all, they're about twice the size of the females, but they have big spines, big spikes going down their back. The females, the spikes are much smaller. You can see here, one just walking around underwater just like it's up on the land. And they can stay down for quite a while. They can either swim or they can walk. And they're constantly being harassed by the sea lions. The sea lions don't hurt the marine iguanas. The sea lions are just incredibly playful. So they'll come down and they'll tug on the marine iguanas' tails and arms and literally just harass them for having fun. The lizards will eat a whole belly full of algae, and they're completely different than the land iguanas. The giant land iguana in the Galapagos lives over 60 years and lives on the hot cactus-covered islands where they eat cactus apples, flowers, and different types of plants. So these gigantic land iguanas that can be orange, red, yellow, incredibly beautiful colors, especially on the males, they live far up from the beach, up on the dry land, and eat cactus, so completely different than the marine iguanas. I've been scuba diving all around the world for years, and the Galapagos Islands is one of the most unique places in the world due to all of these different currents that converge on the islands off the coast of Ecuador. They have a northern current that comes down, they have a Humboldt current that comes up from Peru, a current from Panama, and a current all the way from Indonesia. Some of these currents are warm water and some are cold. The currents that hit part of the islands where the water is warmer have beautiful coral reefs, like these beautiful and stunning black corals that are dotted all over the islands, down in the caves and on the cliffs. The other side of the island that has much more colder currents hitting the islands doesn't have as much coral. So you can dive on one side of the island and see beautiful sea fans and gorgonians like this one, and black coral and mound coral and branching coral. And then you can go to the other side of the island and the water temperature is dramatically colder and there's not any coral there at all. These are the beautiful orange cup corals with their polyps out, feeding on little critters and little algae floating by. The sea turtles tend to gravitate more towards the warmer current areas. This is a Hawksville turtle, which is feeding on sponges on the seafloor, and the green sea turtle. Now these turtles are cold-blooded, they're reptiles, so they have to have a little bit warmer water, so they only can live on part of the Galapagos Islands. On the colder side of the islands, you find these fur seals, which are incredibly rare. They were almost extinct at one period of time because the sailors that came through the Galapagos killed them for their furs. There's sea lions everywhere. The sea lions can inhabit the warmer water and the colder water on both sides of the islands. So once again, the Galapagos is so unique. You'll do a dive in a beautiful coral garden on one side of the islands where the water temperature is a little warmer, and then you'll go to the other side of the island and the water temperature is 10 to 15 degrees colder and there's no coral at all. The sea lions here are just a blast, and this is the same kind of sea lion that lives in Mexico all the way up into California. The big males are about 2 times the size of females. They're incredibly good swimmers underwater. They can hold their breath for a super long period of time, and they're incredibly playful. When they do twirls like that underwater, that's their indication that they want to play. They have their babies up on the beach so they can sit in the warm sun and nurse from the females. Then they have little rookeries. I mean, they're pretty much like a nursery, where the babies all hang out together in a tide pool and play and fight each other. They're really magical to dive with. And then the Galapagos also has penguins, very cold water animals. So gosh, it's got warm water tropical fish on one side of an island and cold water penguins on the other side of the island. There isn't anywhere in the world that has this kind of diversity of marine life that lives all in one area. When visiting the Galapagos Islands, it's just an amazing adventure to go visit the Darwin Research Station on Santa Cruz Island. This station research center opened up in 1964, so scientists could have a research facility to study and manage wildlife for the Galapagos National Park. They learn all about Darwin's voyage to the Galapagos Islands, his discoveries about evolution and natural selection. Experienced local naturalists can give you a tour of the facility and talk about all the different animals that occur on each individual island. You can learn all about the giant Galapagos tortoises. They have an entire breeding farm there. You can completely sit there and visit with the adult tortoises, and then also the nature guides will tell you how they captive breed the tortoises, where they raise the babies, how they hatch the eggs, and their entire really amazing reintroductory program that they're doing right now by putting a lot of these tortoises back on their native islands to rebuild the populations. These baby tortoises are really amazing. They only occur in the Galapagos Islands and also in the Indian Ocean on the Seychelles and Aldabra Islands. They're the largest tortoises in the world. They can live to be over 100 years old. And the Galapagos is the main place where most of the research is being done on how to protect these giant tortoises by successful captive breeding programs. You can visit with the giant adult tortoises that are the breeders. They have certain tortoises there from different islands, so they look a little bit different. These gigantic tortoises, like I say, get to be over 500 pounds, so they're just huge. They're really fun to sit and visit. And you can learn all about some of the really rare tortoises of the past, like Lonesome George, which was the very last living giant tortoise from Pinta Island that died in 2012. There's all kinds of great exhibits explaining about the reproduction of the animals, including how the giant tortoises were taken off the island by early explorers and eaten for food. These very methodical, slow-moving creatures are just super, super fun to hang out with and visit for a little while. I even got to give a really wonderful talk because I had a captive breeding center for exotic reptiles, tortoises, lizards, and snakes in California many years ago, and I was one of the first people to actually captive produce the giant tortoise outside of the Galapagos Islands. So at the research center, I got to give a talk about some of the very early reproductive programs that I got to share with the scientists in the Galapagos Islands many, many, many years ago. Once you're done touring the research center, you can go up the mountain on Santa Cruz and actually visit these giant tortoises in the wild. It is really like being in a true Jurassic Park. These 500-pound huge Galapagos tortoises will just meander right by you. They're so peaceful. They sit there and they eat the native grasses that grow up on the side of the mountain. These tortoises are vegetarians. They've been known to live over 150 years old, and we really don't know how long they can actually live in the wild. It's kind of a great study that's going on right now. But potentially they could live for well over 200 years in the wild. They almost went extinct on several of the islands in the Galapagos because the early whalers removed them from the island and ate them as food out on their ships. One of the things that I liked the best about going on our dive trip to the Galapagos Islands was how remote each one of the islands were, but at the same time, how much knowledge the local guides and naturalists had of each one of the islands. They would take you to very, very remote places where people just don't get to go to, like Genovese Island, where you take the boat and then you hike up on top of the cliffs to visit the birds. Walk down deserted beaches, visiting the marine iguanas. Here the frigate birds are nesting up on Genovese Island. And once again, these animals literally have no fear of people. Baby boobies are bouncing around on the trail right in front of where you walk. They actually got the name booby is because the sailors that visited the Galapagos Islands a couple hundred years ago said they acted like boobies because they just walked right up to people and they had no fear of people. Here the pink-footed booby, and then the gulls that live there that are native, and the naturalists just know everything about all these animals. So it's really a wonderful guided tour, and you can learn all about these amazing creatures with just a couple hours of hiking around the islands. Here's one of the Nazca Boobies feeding its baby. And once again, this is all right next to you when you're walking by. Here's Pamela playing with one of the baby boobies, and then one getting a preening from mom. There isn't hardly anywhere in the world where you can visit wildlife and be so close to it and have it completely unafraid of people. The blue-footed booby. These boobies have different colors that live on different islands, and it's because they feed on different types of fish. Here, coming back from the dive trips with the dive masters, and in between the scuba dives, you visit these remote islands on these cool little Zodiac boats. The naturalists, most all of them, live in the Galapagos or close by in Ecuador, and so they really know the history of the area all the way back from the original volcanic eruptions over 1 million years ago. The names of all the islands, the rock type, the animals, the marine life that lives on all the islands. I don't think I've ever been anywhere in the world, especially as a biologist, where the local guides knew more about their environment than these naturalists here in the Galapagos Islands. You have to be very experienced to have tours there, and you're not allowed as a private citizen to just go visiting these islands on your own. You have to go out with these naturalist guides, and it makes it 10 times better because their knowledge of the area is just incredible. Here we're actually going in an inland lagoon and got to watch the sea turtles breed, and then hike up on the old volcanic lava flows. Some of them, like this one right here, is a relatively new lava flow that only happened a few dozen years ago. There's incredible hiking up to the top of some of these cinder cones where you can sit there and look out over several of the Galapagos Islands. The guides are really amazing, they're very friendly, and it really made a wonderful trip to the Galapagos, not only for scuba diving and snorkeling, but to visit this magical place and all of its wonderful wildlife. Thank you for joining me on this underwater adventure of the Galapagos Islands. Please visit our webpage at Underwater2Web, where you will find our entire worldwide marine life educational series. Aloha from under the surf.